Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Parenting in the Far North. I'm your host, Ariane Aramburo. Today's guest is a very good friend of mine, Dustin Morris, the dedicated director for the Alaska chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. As the sole staff member, he tirelessly covers the entire state, focusing on suicide prevention, education, advocacy for better public policy, and support for loss survivors and those with lived experience. Dustin advocates for increased support to save lives and bring hope to those affected by suicide in Alaska and beyond. Please welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here, Dustin.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
No, I love having you on. And I do want to give a disclaimer. We know today's topic, it could be triggering for some that are listening, and people, we're going to be talking about suicide prevention and signs to look out for. And as always, if you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, your help is available. You can always call or text 988. We want to make sure that we put that out there. But first, let's just begin with you. Let's get to know who Dustin is. You're also a dad, so you got the parent hat that you wear. So tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, as you mentioned, I am a dad. I have 3 littles at home. Mm-hmm. I have a soon-to-be freshman at East High, so I'm excited. I have a middle schooler who will be on his own without his big sister this year, and then I have one that is still in grade school as well, who's going to be a 3rd grader. Believe it or not, I'm like, wow, 3rd grade already.
Right? Yeah, we have our kids are our little ones are. Yeah, I'm gonna have a 3rd grader. You have a middle. Elementary, middle, and a high schooler.
3 schools next year we've got to deal with, and also all those new schedules.
The time changes. You guys are going to be busy.
Yes.
Well, tell me a little bit about how you got into this field. I know you're big on advocacy and being big into the community and support. How did this land in your lap?
It actually happened because of being a dad. So 2019 is when I joined this organization. I was previously working at the Heart Association as the race director for the Heart Run, which I loved, but the state has a notorious problem with suicide. We often are leaders in the nation. We're number 2 right now. And at the time, I really didn't know a lot about the issue, but I had read an article in the paper, and it had listed our suicide rates, and they started at age 10. And at that time, I had a 9-year-old turning 10, and it just broke my heart to think that we live in a world where a 10-year-old might contemplate that, let alone take action to actually end their life. And if I could do something about it, why wouldn't I? And sure enough, I got a phone call from these guys and said, let's go. And that was 5 years ago. So I've been working at it since then.
Talk a little bit about what you do in your kind of day-to-day. I know it's big about reaching out and advocacy, covering the whole entire state, and lots of resources there.
Yeah, so a lot of what I do is collaborating and coordinating with other organizations and volunteers across the state, bringing people together that are working in the mental health field that may otherwise not know about each other. I have a real privilege of being in a position where I get to know about these things, and I have to use that knowledge to bring us together to tackle this problem. And whether that's bringing it to Juneau, or it's hosting a Out of the Darkness walk in Fairbanks, or right now we're collaborating with the community of Dillingham and the surrounding villages to bring awareness to those communities. And it's just every day it's something new. Every day there is a new need that's uncovered, and every day we're working to address that through a lot of different means. But mostly it's through our programs that we get to implement in our schools across the state.
And talk a little bit about the facts regarding teens and suicide. I know you mentioned Alaska. We're number 2, which is not a great number to be in, but what can you share?
Yeah, so when we look at our youth suicide is one of the leading causes of death. It's often either the first or the second leading cause of death, depending on your demographics, how you identify. If you're Alaska Native youth, that tends to be the first leading cause of death for our young people, ages 10 to 24. But in that same demographic for non-Native people, you see it being the second leading cause of death. So no matter who you are, the risk factors are there, and we're seeing an uptick within this group, not just in completions and deaths, but also in attempts in our emergency rooms and our physician clinics. And it's extremely critical right now for our primary care physicians to be catching these things, because they're often our first line of defense.
As parents, what do they need to know?
Yeah, so as parents, especially when we're dealing with teens, there's a lot of changes going on. There's a lot of, sometimes angst, but even in my own experience with my own teenager, who's only 14, but it was like clockwork. The minute she turned 13, we were in it. We were having some issues and we weren't sure what to do. And despite all of my knowledge and background, it still was complicated. It was frustrating as a parent. It was frustrating as a kid. We were able to get my kid into counseling, and so she was receiving monthly counseling and is much better and doing well, and received a lot of good coping skills that we were able to work with her through. But for parents, it's identifying those things and being brave enough to have that conversation. Take
Yeah.
that deep breath, moms, dads, aunties, uncles, whoever you are, and lean into the moment and ask your kid if they're okay and listen and not try to fix it. Just listen. And it's really hard. We're parents. We don't want to see
Yes.
our little
We
struggle,
don't. We
and we've
don't.
been there and we know how to fix it, but we've got to let them, tell us what's going on and be willing to receive it and then work with them to fix it and make them feel like they're part of that process.
Yeah, making them feel comfortable. Risk factors and warning signs. What are some things you can tell parents to kind of like be on the lookout for?
Yeah, so you know your kid. You know them more than anybody else. When they wake up, you know if they're having a good day or a
Yep.
bad day. And it's also leaning into those moments, right? If things are different, if things aren't feeling right, trust your gut. You know your child, and that is a sure sign that something's wrong. And as the trusted adult, you need to lean in and ask, "Are you okay? Have you ever had thoughts of ending your life? Have you had thoughts of suicide?" And we have to ask those questions directly because we often want to soften the ask. We want to say, "You're not thinking of hurting yourself, are
Yeah.
you? Or you wouldn't do anything like that, would you?" And you're not asking directly, "Are you having those thoughts? Do you have a plan? Would you take action?" And those are the things we need to know because a child that's hurting isn't thinking of hurting themselves. They're thinking of, how do I make this pain stop?
Which kind of brings me to the next question. It's more than just being sad and kind of like depression, where there's people that are high functioning out there smiling every day. They're the main like jokester, and you wouldn't think anything's wrong, but it doesn't always look how we think it is,
Yeah.
where someone's moping around, they're sad. I mean, it certainly can, but
Yeah,
speak to that a
so
little
we
bit.
have a really great program called More Than Sad, and it highlights the different types of teen depression that you would see and the way that it might manifest. And it begins with this short film, and it's kind of everything that you think. This person's lethargic, they're really not responsive, they're withdrawn, they seem sad, all the things you think of with depression. And yes, it manifests that way. Then you have this overachiever, this kid who is the stellar student, who gets all A's, who is the key athlete, who people are dependent upon for success and all this stuff, and the anxieties and the stress and the pressures and the immobility that this person has, and the overwhelming sense of trying to live up to everybody else's expectations, and him reaching out for help himself, seeing a sign, seeing a 988 and making that call. But those aren't things that you would necessarily associate with depression. And then just on the other side of that, especially in young males, is anger and impulsivity. If you see kids that are lashing out in anger, or maybe they're suddenly bullying other kids, or they're being more impulsive and not thinking things through and just quick to action, those are also signs of depression. And if those are not normal attributes of your kid, again, that's the time to lean in. What's going on? How are you feeling right now? What can we do? Let's talk about this, and bring the teachers into the conversations and any other trusted adults in this kid's life, because you want them to feel supported, and you want the others to understand my kid's not just being a butt.
Yeah.
They're going through some stuff.
Are there different approaches to talking to the tweens versus the teens? It's a very 10 up to 18.
Yeah.
That's kind of a big gap. To a 10-year-old, how you would talk to a 17-year-old, What
Absolutely.
does that look like?
So I have a range of kids in my house, and each one we've had these types of conversations with, and certainly you just talk to their level, their understanding. Oftentimes, when we're talking to grade school age kids, we're really just talking about feelings, emotions. How are you feeling? Can you describe that feeling to me? They may not have the words. My own teenager at the time, when we were in the thick of it, she couldn't explain to me what she was feeling, but she could point to her chest, to her heart, and say, "It hurts. Dad, it hurts." And I knew what that meant. And so, cue into what your kids are saying to you, because they don't always have the words or the life experiences to really express that. So they're going to lash out. They're going to do things, and it's going to be different for every age level. So bring yourself to that level is really the only advice I can give.
Kind of meeting them where they're at.
Absolutely.
Finding a good mental health professional, that's, that's pretty key.
It's extremely difficult, especially in our state.
Yeah.
So 80% of our state doesn't meet federal guidelines for mental health services, and that means that we are lacking. When we can't meet the federal guidelines, that's the minimum. And our state has a lot of need and very few resources. So it's really important that you're vocal, that you as the adult are an advocate for your kid. If you aren't liking what's happening, that you speak up. If you notice your kid's uncomfortable, that you speak up. Again, often they're trusting the adults in their life, and if they're not comfortable with them, you're not going to get the results that you want. So as the adult, we need to advocate for our kids and make sure that they're having a good experience, that we're seeing the results that we hope for, and if not, that we can navigate a system that's often really difficult with support. And there are resources out there to help parents know what to do and how to get through those really hard systems.
I know you guys have a lot of resources on your website. What do you do if they don't want to talk? I know you said listen, but do you keep trying? How much is too much? You don't want to push too much. I mean, there's no rule book to how to have these conversations.
There's none. And there are the times when your kid's just not going to tell you. They don't want to talk to you. You're the last person they want to tell for many reasons. And so it's good idea. This is the way that I do this, and this is the way that we're kind of taught is, well, if you're not willing to talk to me, is there someone else that you would be willing to talk to? And if you're comfortable with that as the parent, as the adult, I think you should make that an option, but always keep the invitation open. Hopefully your kid comes around and they're wanting to talk to you, but just let them know, like, hey, when you're ready, I'm here. I get it. I've been there too. I don't want to talk about it all the time, but we need to, and we need to remind them that, like, hey, you can't keep it in forever. We've got to talk about it at some point. And when you're ready, I'm here.
What about resources for the LGBTQ community?
Yeah, so we have some really great organizations in our state, but also some national organizations that people can reach out to. And so just even going to afsp.org/LGBTQ, you're going to find a number of resources. And it's always appropriate to ask if the counselor, physician or therapist is LGBTQ competent or any other identities that you might want that person to be competent in. There are websites where it's kind of almost like a dating site where you can kind of put in these things that you're looking for, and a person will pop out that meets that criteria for you. But there are resources there, and they're really needed. We need more resources, and we need more of our communities to make those resources accessible.
You've traveled all over the state, talking about this newness. What are some your boots on the ground? What do you hear from families or parents that have said, we started talking to our child, or maybe what have you heard from on the other end, the kids saying this was helpful from what my parents did?
Yeah. When we go to Juneau especially is when we hear from our youth and how much this is important to them, how much they want to hear about these things in their schools, how much they're affected by their mental health. They're seeing the people that they look up to in entertainment talking about mental health now. Like they've never talked about it before. And so the expectation, it should be that our youth are looking for these things, that they want these things. And we should be accommodating that because it's only going to save lives. And that's the end outcome. And so when I travel the state, everybody's looking for that. They're looking for resources. They want to provide for their kids. They want to answer the questions that their kids have. And so now it's the youth kind of educating the adults on the topic, which is a great thing. I love it.
Yeah, I feel like COVID kind of blew that
absolutely
wide open. Everybody starts now talking about mental health, which is great, moving us in that direction. For, families too and parents, do you hear a little bit of pushback where, kind of like back in the day that nobody talked about their feelings?
Yeah.
And so it's a little bit hard maybe for them to open up with their kiddos, and kind of hard topics like this?
We do see that. Actually, we see that quite a lot. The further away from our urban settings you get, the more pushback that you start to receive, the more thinking of, if we talk about this, this encourages that. And it's just the opposite. When we don't talk about it is when we see suicides occur, when we see attempts occur, and when we see our youth struggling the most. But when we talk about it, when we open ourselves up to those opportunities, we actually see the occurrence go down. And that's what we want. And there is a healthy portion of resistance out there, and we're working through it. And honestly, if it weren't for these kids, I think we wouldn't be as far as we are. But the youth out there are really doing the work. They're doing
Yeah.
amazing things.
What can Alaskans do? Do you need volunteers? What can Alaskans do to get behind this?
Yeah. Well, the number one thing I think people need to do is educate themselves on the topic and know what resources are available in their communities. Because no matter where you're at, it's going to be different. If you're in Anchorage, you probably have the most access. But let's say you're in a place like Tooksik Bay where, you're relying on a school counselor for 6 months of the year, and then through the summer no one's around. What do?
Yeah.
You have to know about 988. You have to be able to call someone and get access to a person that can hear you. So what Alaskans can do is really just educate themselves, look for those resources. Just go to 988.org and you'll find a ton of them, or find AFSP and you'll find them as well.
What about peer-to-peer chats? Do you find that a lot where even not just parents knowing to recognize the signs and what to say, their friends?
Yeah, so we actually just helped, or we advocated for some legislation for peer-to-peer support for our first responders, right? So there's another group that is constantly in this state of seeing trauma, experiencing trauma, and not having resources. And we need our first responders to be at their best. And having a peer-to-peer support group is really, really helpful. In some of the schools, they have a program called You're Not Alone, or they call it YANA, and that is focused on bringing kids together, giving them those social emotional tools that they might be looking for, and just being a support system for them. And it's all led by the youth for youth. And I really love those programs because I think that's where we see the most success, is when we give the kids the tools on how to talk about this smart, and then let them do it.
And I imagine, too, having these kinds of conversations like on this podcast, talking about it more kind of lowers the stigma around the shame of someone maybe attempting it or thinking about it and feeling, I should not be thinking that. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm sure. Talk a little bit about that, that shame stigma that surrounds this topic.
We live in a really diverse state, right? The diversity here is everywhere. You cannot look in a room really and see yourself copy and pasted everywhere, which I love about our community. But with that comes all of those cultural differences, all of those stigmas that come along with that. Even let's talk about our Black and African American community. Within that community, it's really not widely accepted to talk about your mental health. There's a lot of things and nuances to consider, and AFSP took note of that, and we partnered with historically Black colleges, and we said, how do we do this? How do we work within this community where we're seeing a rise in our suicide rates, but we're also seeing a community that's really resistant and for lots of reasons not wanting this kind of help? What do we do? And so we worked within the community to create resources that are culturally competent, that come from within, and have real representation to bring it forward. And we do that with all of our things, whether it's LGBTQ, whether it's Alaska Native, or it's another group that is struggling or needing support. We turn to that group and we look to them for the answers. We're not trying to provide it. We're like, you already have it. Let's figure this out and bring it forward. And that's how we're addressing those stigmas, is trying to do it from within.
And you have a trip that's coming up. You're going to be going to D.C. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you're going to be doing with that?
So every year, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and all of our chapters, and we have chapters across all 50 states and Puerto Rico, we go to D.C. and we meet with our federal delegates and we talk about this issue, and we talk about it very candidly. And this year, our goal is to encourage more federal funding to be delivered to the state of Alaska, to work with our Department of Health, and to make sure that those funds are being applied where they need to go and where they can make the most impact. And that is our goal, that is our aim, to go to DC and to bring back federal dollars that are going to help us in our crusade to stop suicide.
And I will kind of start wrapping this up, but I want to give you kind of the last and final word. Any events, that are coming up that folks can participate in or get involved with? I know you guys are on socials and things like that, so people can find the resources. And then anything else that you want to just mention or add, or kind of a final thought for those listening?
So as we've ended our legislative session recently, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, along with many other nonprofits, have been really pushing forward for an updated guidelines for mental health in our schools. It has been 20 years since we've had an update.
Wow.
Our federal guidelines were recently updated. So again, we're looking at our federal government. They're the bottom line, right? Like, this is where we need to be at best. And so now that the federal government has updated their guidelines, there's no reason that we shouldn't update ours. For them to be 20 years old and our kids still struggling, to see the Surgeon General come to Alaska and really request that we aid our kids, that we end this crisis that we're seeing across the nation, it's really sad that we haven't seen this update yet. And whether it's legislated or the Department of Education decides to do this, or we continue to piecemeal this together with schools across the state, it's really important that our youth understand and know what mental health is, and not be guessing and not be struggling with it, and know that there is help available. So at the end of the day, that's our biggest desire, that's our biggest push right now, is to continue to give kids education opportunities to learn about mental health. And it is not all the controversial things that you hear. It is not the things. I promise you, if you look into it, we're really teaching about your feelings, your thoughts, what to do when you need help, and where to go when it feels like nobody else can do anything for you.
And again, if you want to give your website and the resources too.
Yeah, so you can log on to afsp.org/Alaska. That'll bring you to our Alaska website. Or you can go to 988. You can call, text, or chat when you need help. It's available 24/7 and all year round.
All right. Well, Dustin, thank you so much for coming on, and we will look to see you more in the community and hear back what's going on with DC and that. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And thank you all for listening to another episode of Parenting in the Far North. Don't forget to like and subscribe.